Imagine you're strolling through the bustling avenues of ancient Rome in the year 67 CE, and you encounter a chilling sight that sends shivers down your spine. The emperor himself, Nero, is sauntering through the marketplace, accompanied by what seems to be his new bride, a breathtaking young woman adorned in shimmering silks and sparkling gems. Yet, hushed murmurs trail behind them, for everyone is aware of the ghastly secret. The woman at the side of the world's most powerful man was once a boy named Sporus, and what Nero inflicted upon him stands as one of the most horrific acts of mental and physical torment in documented history. Before we delve into these overlooked tales of endurance and agony, if you're fascinated by uncovering the concealed realities of the past, please consider tapping the like button and subscribing for more stories like this. Also, drop a comment below to share where you're tuning in from. I'm amazed that we're exploring these ancient narratives together, connected across continents and centuries by our mutual fascination with history. What you're about to hear isn't merely another account of Roman extravagance. It's a tale of how unchecked power can twist affection into fixation, sorrow into insanity, and a person into a living puppet crafted to fulfill one man's warped desires. The name Sporus may be unfamiliar, but his story will linger in your mind long after you've heard it. Let's begin with the man who orchestrated this tragedy. Nero wasn't inherently malevolent. In fact, his early rule sparkled with potential. When he took the throne at just 16, many Romans believed they were on the cusp of a golden era. He lowered taxes, sponsored public spectacles, and even took to the stage in theatrical performances that charmed the masses. But absolute authority has a way of corroding even the most hopeful spirits. By 65 CE, something had shattered within Nero's psyche. Perhaps it was the relentless paranoia of knowing everyone coveted his throne. Perhaps it was the loneliness of being the sole person in an empire of 60 million who could never be questioned, opposed, or corrected. Or perhaps it was the loss of the one person he claimed to cherish above all else. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and she embodied everything Nero desired in a woman. Stunningly beautiful, clever enough to match his lofty self-image, and driven enough to share his aspirations for eternal fame. Poppaea wasn't just another lovely face in the imperial court. She possessed a keen political acumen that made her a powerful ally or a perilous foe. When Nero first saw Poppaea, he was already wed to Octavia, daughter of the prior emperor, in a cold, loveless political union. Poppaea was everything Octavia was not, vivacious where Octavia was subdued, commanding where Octavia shunned the spotlight. The affair between Nero and Poppaea began as a typical Roman scandal. But what started as infidelity soon morphed into something far more dangerous, an all-consuming obsession. Nero wasn't merely drawn to Poppaea's beauty, he was utterly devoured by her, in a way that alarmed even his closest confidants. Ancient chroniclers describe Nero's behavior during this time as increasingly unstable and possessive. He would erupt into violent rages if other men lingered too long in Poppaea's presence at public events. He stationed guards around her constantly, claiming it was for her safety but truly to monitor her every move. He showered her with extravagant gifts that drained the imperial coffers, jewels from distant lands, silks from far-off realms, and perfumes from exotic regions. Most strikingly, he began reshaping reality itself to feed his fixation. First, he divorced Octavia, a bold move that alienated many allies. Then, he declared his intent to wed Poppaea in a lavish imperial ceremony. The wedding was a display of unparalleled opulence, with Nero sparing no expense to proclaim his devotion. Yet, even marriage couldn't sate Nero's need to possess Poppaea entirely. He began isolating her from her family and friends, surrounding her with loyalists who owed their status solely to him. He commissioned countless portraits and statues of her, not only for public display but for his private chambers, so he could gaze upon her likeness even in her absence. Ancient sources recount how Nero would sometimes spend hours simply observing Poppaea as she went about her daily tasks. This wasn't love. It was the behavior of someone who had blurred the line between affection and ownership, viewing another person not as an individual but as a beautiful possession existing solely for his pleasure. Poppaea, for her part, seemed to grasp the perilous game she was playing. She was astute enough to recognize that her beauty and Nero's obsession granted her immense influence, but also wise enough to know this power carried grave risks. She used her sway to advance her family's interests, building a network of allies to shield her if Nero's affections ever faltered. But Poppaea had one critical weakness: she wasn't afraid to challenge Nero. Unlike the rest of the imperial court who had learned to anticipate the emperor's moods, Poppaea retained her independent spirit. She would debate him on policy, critique his artistic endeavors, and even ridicule his performances when she deemed them lackluster. The details of what transpired on that fateful day in 65 CE vary by source, but the outcome is undisputed. During what began as a routine argument, some say over Nero's late return from chariot races, others over his theatrical obsessions, the emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him forever. According to the historian Tacitus, the dispute escalated when Poppaea dared to question Nero's priorities, suggesting he cared more about his public persona than his duties as a husband and father. Pregnant with what would have been their second child, Poppaea may have been less tolerant of Nero's erratic behavior due to the strain of her condition. What followed remains debated, but most agree that Nero, in a fit of rage, struck or kicked his pregnant wife with such force that she suffered fatal injuries. Some accounts describe a single blow to her abdomen. Others depict a brutal assault that left her bleeding and unconscious on the palace floor. Picture the moment Nero realized what he had done. The man who commanded legions, who could order executions with a word, who was revered as a god in distant provinces, had just destroyed the one person he truly valued. Ancient sources describe the aftermath as one of the most pitiful scenes in imperial history. Nero reportedly flung himself onto Poppaea's body, alternating between begging for her forgiveness and demanding she live, as if his imperial authority could defy death itself. He summoned Rome's finest physicians, offering them vast wealth to save her and threatening torture if they failed. But it was too late. Poppaea died within hours, taking their unborn child with her. In that moment, something snapped within Nero's mind. His grief wasn't just emotional devastation, it was a complete detachment from reality. His mourning became the stuff of legend. Defying Roman custom, he refused to cremate Poppaea's body, instead having it embalmed and placed in a tomb grander than those of previous emperors. He declared her a goddess, established a cult in her honor, and spent days conversing with her corpse as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now faced an even more perilous environment. Forced to uphold the pretense that Poppaea was still alive, speaking of her in the present tense and leaving her favorite seat vacant at banquets. Anyone who suggested Nero move on faced exile or worse. It was during this time that Sporus caught Nero's attention, though the young man had no inkling of the nightmare awaiting him. Likely around 14 or 15, Sporus was born into slavery in the imperial household and freed as a child. Raised within the palace, he received an education preparing him for administrative roles, a relatively privileged position, as freedmen in imperial service often lived better than many freeborn citizens. But this privilege came with absolute dependence on imperial favor. Freedmen owed everything to their former masters, leaving them vulnerable to being elevated or discarded at a whim, with no legal protections. What drew Nero to Sporus wasn't his intellect or abilities, it was his face. Multiple sources confirm that Sporus bore an eerie resemblance to the late Poppaea, particularly in his eyes and delicate features. In a culture where physical likeness was seen as a sign of deeper spiritual connection, this resemblance must have seemed almost otherworldly. When Nero first saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in his fractured mind. Here was a chance to undo the irreparable, to resurrect what he had destroyed. The likeness was so striking that Nero may have briefly believed he was seeing Poppaea's spirit reborn. There was, of course, one glaring issue: Sporus was male. But for a man who considered himself divine and spoke to a corpse for months, altering someone's gender seemed a trivial hurdle. What followed was one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in history. Nero didn't simply order Sporus to dress as a woman. He decided to make the transformation permanent. He summoned Rome's top physicians and commanded them to perform surgery to feminize the young man. This wasn't mere mutilation, it was the systematic erasure of Sporus' identity. The procedure was excruciating, dangerous, and irreversible, often fatal due to infection or blood loss. Even if Sporus survived, he would be forever altered, physically, emotionally, and socially. He could never father children, form typical relationships, or be seen as fully male in Roman society. The surgery took place in a specially prepared section of the imperial palace. Ancient medical techniques were rudimentary, relying on basic tools and minimal anesthesia. The process would have been agonizing, lasting hours, with Sporus restrained by guards as physicians worked, his cries ignored. If he survived the ordeal, recovery would have taken weeks or months. Once healed, Nero announced a decision that stunned even Rome's jaded elite: he would marry Sporus in a full imperial wedding. The preparations were exhaustive and lavish. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the late Empress, and moved to private quarters where he was groomed for his role. Imperial seamstresses crafted gowns to flatter his altered body and conceal any remaining masculine traits. Jewelers designed ornaments, many incorporating gems once worn by Poppaea, serving as physical ties to the woman Sporus was forced to replace. Makeup artists taught him to enhance his features with cosmetics, kohl to enlarge his eyes, rouge for rosy cheeks, powders to soften his face. These weren't just aesthetic changes, they were steps in erasing his original self. Hairdressers trained him in elaborate styling techniques favored by Rome's aristocratic women, using heated tools and costly ornaments in a daily process that took hours. Most devastating were the lessons in feminine behavior. Tutors instructed Sporus on how to walk, sit, and gesture in a ladylike manner, while voice coaches worked to raise his pitch and adopt feminine speech patterns, a grueling task, as vocal habits are deeply ingrained. Can you fathom the psychological torment of this transformation? Every day, Sporus faced a mirror reflecting a stranger. Every lesson in femininity reminded him his identity was being erased. Every jewel once worn by Poppaea was a chain binding him to a role he never chose. The wedding, set for spring 67 CE, was timed to align with religious festivals for added grandeur. Held in the palace's grandest hall, it was adorned with exotic flowers and lit by countless lamps. Musicians played traditional hymns, and servants offered fine wines and delicacies. To outsiders unaware of the truth, it might have seemed a typical imperial wedding. But those in the know witnessed something deeply unsettling: the world's most powerful man marrying a surgically altered teenage boy dressed as his deceased wife. The ceremony included all traditional Roman rituals, vows, hand-joining, sharing sacred bread, and signing legal documents. Guests, skilled in courtly pretense, offered congratulations and lavish gifts, masking their horror and fascination. After the wedding, Nero treated Sporus as a true empress, granting him a household, palace quarters, and an income. He traveled in a litter, rode horses, and had a retinue. But this luxury came at a horrific cost: the complete erasure of his identity and the constant performance of a soul-crushing role. Sporus accompanied Nero to public events, sat beside him at state dinners, and played the devoted wife. Nero seemed to believe he had resurrected Poppaea, calling Sporus by her name, reminiscing about non-existent shared memories, and expecting responses that upheld the fiction. For Sporus, every day was a high-stakes act where a single misstep could mean death. He had to not only look and act like a woman but respond as if he were Poppaea herself. Ancient sources note Sporus grew adept at this deception, anticipating Nero's moods with almost uncanny precision. Yet, they also describe him becoming increasingly withdrawn and melancholic, though he performed flawlessly in public. The psychological toll is unimaginable: waking daily in rooms evoking a woman he never knew, seeing a stranger in every mirror, and living a life built on someone else's memories. For over 2 years, Sporus endured this surreal existence. His ordeal intensified when Nero decided to tour Greece, eager to perform in festivals where he believed his artistic talents would shine. Sporus, displayed as Rome's empress, accompanied him, leaving Greek dignitaries baffled by their conqueror's insistence on treating a teenage boy dressed as a woman as reality. By 68 CE, Nero's excesses had alienated the Roman elite. Rebellions erupted, led by governors fed up with his erratic rule. The Praetorian Guard and Senate turned against him, declaring him an enemy of the state. As Nero fled Rome with a small entourage, Sporus was among them, his living reminder of Poppaea too precious to leave behind. They hid in a villa outside Rome, awaiting rescue or capture, as Nero vacillated between grand escape plans and theatrical suicide preparations. When enemies closed in, Nero chose death over capture. His suicide left Sporus vulnerable as a symbol of Nero's reign, both a prize and a liability for the next ruler. What followed was even more tragic. Sporus became a political pawn, passed among powerful men named Poppaea Sabinus, Otho, then Vitellius, each treating him as Nero had, dressed as a woman and called Poppaea. Under Vitellius, Sporus faced his final degradation, public humiliation in the Colosseum. Cast in a violent, degrading mythological reenactment. Rather than endure this, Sporus made his only true choice in years: he took his own life, likely by poison. In 69 CE, at no more than 20 years old. In death, Sporus escaped the grotesque theater of his life. His story became a cautionary tale of absolute power's dangers and the human cost of imperial excess. Ancient historians viewed him more as a symbol of decadence than a person. What makes his story haunting isn't just the abuse but the systematic stripping of his identity and agency. From the moment Nero saw Poppaea in his face, Sporus ceased to exist as an individual, becoming a canvas for the emperor's warped fantasies. His suicide was both a tragedy and a defiant act, a refusal to be further degraded, even at the cost of his life. Tragically, we know almost nothing of Sporus before his transformation. His hopes, dreams, or aspirations, all erased when he became Nero's living doll. His story, that of a boy forced to become an empress, enduring years of abuse and choosing death over further humiliation, deserves remembrance not as a mere historical curiosity but as a testament to human cruelty and resilience. In choosing death, Sporus reclaimed the one thing denied him: the power to decide his fate. His story reminds us that behind every grand historical narrative lie individual tales of suffering and survival, deserving our attention and compassion across 2 millennia.